This is how Mongol warriors conquered entire kingdoms in days. Now, this is what they did to those who resisted. When the Mongols rode into your city, there were no miracles, no mercy, and no survivors. Men were butchered. Women were taken. Children were turned into slaves or burned alive. But what made the Mongols truly terrifying wasn't just their swords or their arrows. It was what came after the battle. They didn't just destroy cities, they erased entire civilizations. To the Mongols, fear itself was a weapon. They didn't just kill their enemies, they made sure the world remembered how they died. And that's why, even centuries later, the name Genghis Khan still echoes like thunder across history. Imagine living in a small, peaceful city. Merchants opening their stalls, children playing by the river, priests ringing the morning bells. Then, one morning, you hear something strange in the distance. Not thunder, not drums, but the deep, rhythmic sound of hooves, thousands of them. Before anyone can even react, the ground starts shaking. The sky darkens with dust. And from that brown storm, they appear horsemen with bows, faces wrapped in fur, eyes cold as winter. The Mongols. This wasn't just an army. This was a moving storm of fear. Led by a man named Genghis Khan, they came from the cold, empty plains of Mongolia, a place so harsh that only the toughest could survive. And that's exactly what they were. Tough, disciplined, and frighteningly organized. You see, the Mongols weren't just good at fighting, they turned war into science. Every movement, every attack was planned like a chess game. They rode faster, hit harder, and disappeared before their enemies even understood what was happening. And when they came back, it wasn't to fight, it was to erase. Within a few decades, they built the largest land empire in human history. From China to Eastern Europe, from Persia to Russia, no one could stop them. Cities that resisted vanished. Populations were wiped out. And yet, strangely, they weren't just about destruction. They were also incredibly clever, using fear itself as their most powerful weapon. Because the Mongols didn't just conquer land, they conquered minds. They made sure the next city heard what happened to the last one. And by the time the hooves reached your gates, surrender seemed like the only choice left. This was the world under the shadow of the Mongol Empire, a world where one name alone could make kings tremble. If you've ever watched a war movie, you've probably seen soldiers charge headfirst into battle, swords clashing, arrows flying. But the Mongols, they didn't fight like that. They fought like ghosts appearing from nowhere, striking fast and vanishing before you could even understand what hit you. Their leader, Genghis Khan, didn't build his empire through luck or brute strength alone. He built it with discipline and strategy. Every Mongol warrior was both a soldier and a tactician. From the moment they could walk, they were trained to ride horses and shoot arrows with deadly accuracy. It's said a Mongol could fire 6 arrows in the time it took a European knight to notch one. And all of them could hit a target while riding at full speed. But their true genius wasn't just in skill, it was in organization. Their armies were divided into precise units, each knowing exactly what to do without confusion. They communicated across miles using flags, drums, and horns, a medieval version of radio signals. Their most famous trick was the feigned retreat, pretending to flee in panic, only to lure the enemy into an ambush. It worked every time. Kingdom after kingdom fell for it. What seemed like cowardice was actually the deadliest trap in warfare. And then came their psychological warfare, something no other army had perfected. The Mongols spread terror deliberately. If one city resisted, they would destroy it completely. Every building, every person, every memory. Then they'd let the survivors flee to spread the story. So when the next city heard the Mongols were coming, many surrendered instantly without a fight. That's how they conquered, faster than any empire in history. They didn't just defeat their enemies on the battlefield, they destroyed their courage before the first arrow was even fired. It wasn't just war, it was a performance of fear. And Genghis Khan, he was the director of the world's most terrifying show. Now imagine this. You're a soldier in a proud city. Maybe Baghdad, maybe Kiev, maybe Samarkand. The Mongols have surrounded your walls. You've heard the stories. Entire towns erased. skulls stacked like pyramids. The fear alone feels heavier than your sword. When the gates finally fall, there's no mercy. The Mongols move through the city with terrifying precision. No chaos, no hesitation, just a cold, organized execution. The rule was simple. If you resist, you die. For the men, that meant total annihilation. Soldiers, merchants, even priests, if you could hold a weapon, you were marked for death. Some were lined up and beheaded one by one. Others were buried alive. And sometimes they built pyramids of skulls outside the city walls, a gruesome warning to anyone thinking of resisting next. But it wasn't just about killing people. It was about killing hope. The Mongols understood that if they wiped out the men, they wiped out the city's future. No one left to rebuild, no one to avenge, no one to lead. They didn't just conquer land, they erased entire bloodlines. The few who survived had a purpose. Craftsmen and engineers were spared not out of pity, but usefulness. They were shipped off to other parts of the empire to build fortresses, weapons, or bridges for their conquerors. Skilled scribes were forced to keep Mongol records. The rest, ordinary men with nothing to offer, were executed. Even surrender didn't always save you. If your city had resisted first and then begged for mercy, it was too late. The Mongols didn't negotiate twice. Their punishment was meant to be remembered for generations. So when the next city heard the hoofbeats in the distance, they knew what those sounds meant. Not just war, but extinction. This was Mongol justice. Swift, absolute, and unforgettable. They weren't fighting wars anymore. They were sending messages written in blood. If the men met death, the women met something far worse, a life that felt like dying every single day. When the Mongols stormed a city, the women were not spared. But don't mistake that for mercy. Their survival was deliberate, a part of the Mongols' brutal design. Killing men destroyed armies. Taking women destroyed generations. After every conquest, the women were rounded up like spoils of war. Young girls, mothers, even queens, all stripped of their names, their clothes, their identity. Some were handed over to soldiers as trophies. Others were sold into slavery along the Silk Road, traded for gold, horses, or weapons. Their fate depended not on who they were, but on how valuable they looked to their captors. For the noble women, the humiliation was even worse. Imagine being a queen one day, sitting beside your husband, ruler of a kingdom, and a Mongol general storms your palace. By morning, he's sitting on your throne, and you are now part of his booty. Some were taken as concubines, forced to bear the children of the men who murdered their husbands and burned their homes. It was psychological warfare at its cruelest, ensuring that the bloodline of their enemies ended with them. The rest lived as slaves, cooking, cleaning, and serving in silence, often abused beyond words. A few were sold into foreign markets. Others simply disappeared into the vastness of the Mongol Empire, their stories buried under centuries of dust. What's haunting is how systematic it all was. This wasn't random cruelty, it was policy. A message to every city that dared to resist. Your men will die, your women will serve us, and your children will bear our blood. For those women, survival wasn't a blessing, it was a sentence. A life of endless reminders that everything they once were, family, freedom, faith, was gone forever. Now, here's where it all starts to make chilling sense. The Mongols weren't just killing and enslaving for fun. Everything they did, every massacre, every burned city, every enslaved woman, was part of a strategy, a cold, calculated form of psychological warfare. See, most empires conquered to expand territory. The Mongols conquered to control minds. They understood something most armies didn't. Fear travels faster than soldiers. You don't need to fight 10 cities if you make one city so terrified that the next 9 surrender before you even arrive. That's why they made their brutality visible, pyramids of skulls outside city gates, rivers running red with blood, and survivors sent ahead to spread the horror stories. Each act of cruelty was a message to the next city. Look what happens when you resist. And it worked. Whole kingdoms collapsed without a single arrow fired. Some rulers opened their gates the moment they saw Mongol banners on the horizon. Others fled, abandoning their people entirely. The Mongols didn't just defeat armies, they broke the human spirit. Even their treatment of women had purpose. By taking the wives and daughters of conquered men, they destroyed family honor, crushed morale, and rewrote bloodlines. It was psychological warfare, disguised as tradition. Once you take away a man's legacy, you take away his reason to fight. What made it even more terrifying was how organized it all was. The Mongols kept records, assigned ranks, and distributed captives as if running a factory of fear. This wasn't chaos, it was administrative terror. Their cruelty wasn't random, it was efficient, predictable, almost mechanical. And that's what made it so terrifying. Because when your enemy kills without rage, without passion, only with purpose, that's when you realize you're not fighting men anymore. You're fighting a system. When you look back at the Mongol Empire, it's easy to get lost in the scale, the maps, the numbers, the speed at which they swallowed half the known world. But behind those facts lies something far more haunting, the psychological genius of fear. They didn't just build an empire with horses and arrows, they built it with terror. They used fear as both a sword and a shield. And for over a century, it worked flawlessly. No empire before or after managed to weaponize the human mind quite like they did. Think about it, cities like Baghdad, once the center of science and civilization, were wiped off the map in days. Kiev, Nishapur, Samarkand, all fell not just to force, but to the idea that resistance was hopeless. The Mongols didn't need to fight every war. Their reputation fought for them. And for the women left behind, survival became its own kind of death. Their pain wasn't just personal, it was political. It sent a message: defy the great Khan, and even your bloodline won't survive. That's how deep their control ran, from the battlefield to the bedroom, from the throne to the cradle. But here's the paradox. This empire of terror also built one of the most connected and stable periods in history, known as the Pax Mongolica. Roads, trade, and cultural exchange flourished under the same system that began in fire and blood. The world became smaller, faster, more global, but it was born through unimaginable cruelty. So when we say the Mongols ruled with fear, we're not talking about random savagery. We're talking about a deliberate design, a system that proved fear can conquer faster than any army. And maybe that's the scariest part. Because long after their empire turned to dust, their lesson remained clear. You don't need to rule people's lands if you can rule their minds.